We made this.
Just take a look at my life now. Take a look at my dreams. Look up to the sky now. It's not what it seems.
Hello everyone and welcome to Pick Up a Podcast, the podcast about podcasters and podcasting. My name is Kurt North and I am your host, and this week we are delving not just only into podcasts but into networks as well. And with me I have somebody who's been hovering around us, omnipresent over the last 13 or 15 episodes that we've been doing. It's Tony Black. Tony, welcome to the show. I'm finally so happy that you're back onto another one of my podcasts, and it's a pleasure to have you on to discuss all things We Made This. So how are you doing?
I'm all right, thanks, Kurt. It's really nice to be on Pick Up a Podcast, which I wouldn't say I've necessarily been a producer as such, but sort of been the executive producer over the network it's on. So it's been really interesting to see you talk to all these different people about their podcasting journey, and I'm quite happy I get to do mine right now, really.
Absolutely, and earlier on I thought this would be a good thing to bookend, is that I spoke to your good friend Matt Latham on episode 1.
Can I just fact check there? He's not my good friend. He's
right, okay.
No, he is. I just like to take any opportunity I can to take him down a peg or two, really.
Well, I've heard that, and to be fair, he wasn't. There wasn't the scoops that I was hoping for on episode 1. There was some a few little things. But yeah, so what did you make of Matt's little discussion with me? Then were you happy with what he said about you? About this, I think you were saving some Romanian people in a hospital or something last time when he mentioned that. So
he's got some wacky stories. I sometimes think that he conflates reality with his own fiction in his head. But I think it was actually really nice what he was saying, to be honest, and it was quite. You know, he jokes about how he can't ever really say anything nice about me because he finds it too weird, and it's sort of a running thing between us in that our relationship is heavily built on taking the piss out of each other, really. But it is nice, and I'm really pleased that he's getting a lot out of Pick a Disc, which is obviously one of the other We Made This shows, because he's always enjoyed podcasting. He's always enjoyed music. He's a massive music guy. He's got incredible music knowledge, and it's just really nice to see him really be able to tap into an output. And if I've helped him with that a little bit, then that's what this is all about, really.
Yeah, I mean, he joked around saying that his previous podcasts have been 4 or 5 episodes, and he's now he's found his niche, really, and it's good to see, and some of the podcasts he's been doing with Pick a Disc have been absolutely fantastic. But we're not here to talk about Matt as much as I would like to talk about him. But
I wouldn't like to talk about him at all. No, it's fine.
But one thing, it's no surprise that that episode lasted over an hour and a half when the previous other ones have been lasting around 40 minutes.
Yeah, you try and be in a room with him. You try and be in a room with him having a conversation. I tell you, you'll never get away.
So we're here to talk about yourself, Tony. So can you just give us a very quick brief history of what your things were with regards to how you got into podcasting? Because your story is a bit different. We're going to be talking about your network and which is what this is on, and we're going to talk about a few other things as well with regards to your main baby being the Xcast and the like, which is the X-Files podcast. But I'd like to just get an idea of up until I would say the Xcast as such, because that was the main show that you got running and has been its longest running, and kind of like the what would you call it? It's like the main headliner for the podcast, really, for the network, really. So how did you get into podcasting? Where did that fire get lit for you? How did you start with that?
Well, I've been trying to think about this recently, and I did a podcast recently called Home Brew, which is for the guys at Time for Cakes and Ale, which is a really nice collection of podcasts by 2 guys called Bex and Eason, and they do things like talk about The Prisoner and talk about Twin Peaks and stuff, and they're great. And they invited me on this show where during the lockdown, because as we record this, we're in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, they're doing a show about people's hobbies and people's interests, and they very kindly invited me on. We were talking a little bit about some of this, and they asked me, where did it all begin? And since then, I was thinking about it. There was a point before I told them, which is where I sort of, in my head, begin all this, where I was actually dabbling into this. As I said on that show, my first memory of listening to podcasts as such was the Ricky Gervais show with Stephen Merchant, Carl Pilkington, which was massive hit. And I think they may have coined the term podcasting, possibly, or it was around that point, mid-2005, 2006. And I'd never really been somebody who'd listened to radio, particularly. I was never into that stuff myself necessarily, which seems strange because podcasting is in many ways, it's been described, I think, as like the American radio, because it kind of all partly kicked off over there as sort of an antidote to the fact they don't have radio like we do in the UK, for instance. So at the time, I was more involved in the place I met Matt Latham. In fact, he may have talked about this on his episode, a place called MZP TV, which is where we wrote scripts and we would create fan fiction and things like that. And that's where he and I met. And I remember I was writing, funnily talking about the X-Files, I was writing a show, like a fan fiction wrap-up before the series came back. So around 2000 and... what would this be, 10, something like that? 2011, maybe 2012, actually, to tie in with a particular date in the X-Files. I was writing a fan fiction sequel. And I remember at the time I was dating somebody who was a massive X-Files fan, and we did some podcasts for that were just recorded over computer and uploaded as these massive sort of MP3 files onto the server. And the editing was obviously terrible. The sound quality wasn't good. And it was very sort of informal and rambling, really. And we were just talking about the X-Files. And I remember doing those, and I got a lot of enjoyment out of those. And then subsequently, I did a few podcasts around sort of the topics on MZP we were talking about, but they didn't go on any kind of platform that we recognise today. All they did was go on this website, which was, looking back, it was very niche. I mean, you'd write something and you might get like 10, 15 eyes on it, and you'd get feedback and we'd discuss, but it was incredibly niche, really, what we were doing. So there would hardly have been many people listening to those, and there was no way to sort of tell. There was no metrics. There was nothing like that to sort of tell, are people listening, like we can, to some extent, get today on our platforms we use. So it was more just dabbling. It was more just having fun with it. And so I was doing that, and I did enjoy that. And then it got to the start of 2014, and for some reason, I had the notion to talk about films. And I don't quite know, I keep thinking back to this, where that came from. What made me get in front of my Mac at the time, my iMac, and create what was called Black Hole Cinema, which was the first show. And they were on We Made This, but I took them all off because of network sort of space reasons, because I want newer shows to have the space to podcast.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to dive into them before you took them off, actually. But
well, lucky is one word. I think they were fine. They were like a practice for me, and it was me talking into a mic. And at first, it was just me for the first few episodes talking about the films at the start of 2014. So that's things like American Hustle and 12 Years a Slave, that kind of stuff. And the sound quality again wasn't very good because there was no proper microphone. There were no pop filter. There's no sound stuff going. It was in my because I lived in a flat at that time on the ground floor, and it was very open plan. So the acoustics would have been terrible. I can't go back to that. I would, if I listened back to it, it would probably put me off doing podcasts again, because it was a practice. It was, for me, Black Hole Cinema. And it's even when I started talking to other people, it felt like a dry run. It felt, looking back now, it was me testing the water of whether actually, do I have something to say about this stuff? And I guess I did, really. So, but I'd love to be able to say to you, there was something I listened to, or there was something I read that made me go, I'm going to podcast. It was just something I decided on a whim to have a go at.
And do you think that because the X-Cast came a bit later on in all the trials that you've did, as I say, I listened to, I think it was the 12 Years a Slave one, because I do remember it was just you talking. I didn't listen to all of them. I think it was more in preparation for Matt's show, because I wanted to kind of catch into what that was, because I was aware that he was involved in some of that. So yeah, so that was interesting listening to that. But with all these practices and stuff, where did likes of premature culture come in on Trek FM? Was that before or after you started the X-Cast, and how much of an effect did working in that network come about from you? What kind of things did you take away from doing that?
Well, just before that, just going back quickly to Black Hole Cinema, the Latham was on those, because I started getting guests on, and at the time, the people really I was pulling from were from MZP. A lot of the early guests on that show, and to be fair, it's fine to listen to. It's not unlistenable. I'm probably playing it down a little bit. They're okay, but they are kind of their time in a way because they were recorded in 2014. So it's whether or not you want to go back and listen to people talking about films with no sort of structure to them at that point. If that's your kind of thing, let me know, because I can probably send you some of the files. And maybe one day they will go back online somewhere. But anyway, I was pulling from guests who weren't podcasters. That whole... And some of them have since become podcasters, or they've tried their hand in it since. But quite a lot of the people on those early episodes are not people who I would record with now. So the Primitive Culture was after the Xcast. The Xcast came about at the end of 2015, and I'm sure we'll talk about that in a sec, so I'll park that. But with Primitive Culture, that came about because at the end of 2016, I had started listening to Trek FM. Primitive Culture is a show I co-created with the author Duncan Barrett on Trek FM, which is a very successful Star Trek podcast network. I would say probably the most successful online, really, in terms of prestige and stuff like that. They're really good. And I started listening to them through my friend Zach Moore, who I met online on Twitter, and who was one of the people I invited on I remember when the Xcast started, I put a call out on Twitter saying, anyone like the X-Files? Anyone podcast? Anyone want to podcast? Come and have a chat. And he was one of the people who said, yeah, man, I love that. And so since then, he's become a friend. So he said, I host a show called Standard Orbit, which was about the original series of Star Trek. So which I've since guested on. So I went over there, and actually, Standard Orbit was great because it helped get me through a difficult point. Around the end of 2016, I had a few mental health issues with anxiety, and I was going for some counselling once a week. And I used to remember leaving work, and I'd get on the bus, and it was always Standard Orbit that was out on that day. And I vividly remember listening to those episodes with Zach and a guy called Ken Tripp, who he hosted it with. They've since just moved on from that show, and they would. They'd be talking about Star Trek, and it was great. It really helped me get through those journeys to those sessions and back. So, I thank them a lot for that, really. And after that, I started listening to more Trek FM stuff into 2017. And then around the Easter of 2017, I had this idea for a show called Primitive Culture, which would look at the culture and history around Star Trek, which was a topic that's always interested me. And it was sort of off the back of another show on that network called Metatreks, which is still going, actually, and they would talk about the philosophy side of Star Trek. It's a fascinating show, very learned hosts, and I thought there's a space for this, and I hadn't heard anything like that online before in terms of the Star Trek universe, which is massive, as you know, because you're a big Trekkie. And there's so much to discuss around culture, around history, that ties into Star Trek. And Duncan had been on Metatreks talking about, I think, his book. He'd written a book called The Human Frontier, which sort of dabbles a little bit into the areas of philosophy and history. And I just messaged him and said, would you be interested in collaborating on a project like this? And that was it. It just took off. He was very keen. We recorded, got on well. And, now Primitive Culture's racing towards its 100th episode after 3 years, and I still occasionally go on and guest semi-regularly. I stepped away as host probably about 6 months after it started to focus on the Xcast and things like that, but it's still going strong, and Duncan's really taken the lead with it and has recorded some fantastic episodes. As of last week, he's even interviewed Nicholas Meyer, who directed Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan and things like that. So fantastic interview. So yeah, I'm very proud of that show, actually. I'm very even though it's not on my network, I am really proud of it. And Trek FM taught me a lot, I think, as in that I've borrowed certain things from them in the way that Chris Jones, who's the network exec over there, who created Trek FM, has sort of established that network. And I'll confess, I do believe in the whole maxim of, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. I think steal from people who are good at stuff, steal from people with good ideas, without being mercenary, just I will happily admit, I'd happily admit to Chris and I've taken things from Zach's approach to podcasting. I'd happily say to them, I thought that was great. I've borrowed it. I hope you don't mind, because I think that's part of, I think really with podcasting, you really do learn as you go. It's a very much you pick things up from other people, you network, you talk to people. And I mean, the very thing that we do to start a podcast, which is called the 3, 2, 1 clap, which allows us to sync up our audio feeds. I got that from Zach Moore because he did that when we first recorded. And I was like, that's a really good idea. So simple, but effective. And so Trek FM and the people involved definitely were I think a turning point for me in sort of learning bits and bobs about the podcasting trade.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the things I was going to ask, actually, with regards to the structure that you have. I mean, we'll talk about the Xcast shortly, but in what ways do you feel that you've ported over a lot of things? So if you looked at the first episode of the Xcast as it was then, when we're talking about either the primer or the pilot, compared to an episode, say, in season 5, which we're currently on with the Xcast, where do you particularly find that you've changed the most, or have created the right formula? What have you learned the most between those 5 years?
It's a difficult one to answer in a way, because with the Xcast, to some extent, it hasn't massively changed, particularly in terms of the structure of those episodes, because they are a fairly standard format and have been since the beginning. You talk about the episode, you go in depth, and we're lucky enough at the point now where we can get fan listener feedback, and we can add that in, which we didn't have at the beginning because it was a new show. But I think structurally that's much the same. I suppose what I feel has changed over the last 5 years is that the audio quality I think is better than it would be at the beginning. I think my confidence as a host has probably improved since that point. I'm less afraid to have longer discussions. I mean, I joked with a guy called Dave Bond who does who's been on Pick Up a Podcast, actually, talking about his show. Do you expect me to talk? And do you expect us to talk? Sorry. And he and I have often joked about how their podcasts can be quite long. And there was a point I think a few years ago I said, some of them are a bit long and this kind of thing, and he takes the mickey out of me now when a when a podcast goes over 2 hours. But I feel like maybe he was right in some respects. I feel like I was quite obsessed with making sure that they were under an hour for a while, and I'm less concerned about that now. I feel that I think I've learned that people will listen as long as within reason, as long as you engage them. Really, I think anything that's 3 hours plus, I think you're asking a lot. But I think 2 hours and a bit, I think if people like you and like what you're doing and like what you're talking about, they'll go with it. And I think people sometimes like longer podcasts. I think they like to soak into a show. I think they like, some people, the process of just sitting back and letting for a couple of hours and doing other things and commuting and doing chores and however they listen to podcasts. I think I've learned that. I think the not feeling like it's got to be too contained, and then it's just picking things up along the way. It's little, like I've talked about, some of the little tricks and audio bits and bobs that now maybe make it sound a little bit better and is edited a little bit better. But I think with this kind of thing, you never stop learning, really. I think it's a constant evolution as the technology evolves and as the quality evolves and as the style evolves.
While we're just quickly, briefly talking about the quality and stuff, you started off with an iMac. Where's your progression been from a technical standpoint? What did you start with, and what are you currently using at the moment?
So I started literally with talking into the Mac. So it would be my built-in recording stuff, and obviously if you do built-in, if you're talking into the mic on your own, then it doesn't sound very good, but at least you don't have to worry about feedback or anything like that. Whereas I think when I was doing that with other people, I imagine if I listen back to some of those early episodes, there is the ghosting effect where you can hear my voice on some of their tracks and all that kind of stuff, because I didn't used to do the solo editing. It was all over Skype, so I'd probably be editing one track at that point. So I can imagine there's all kinds of things on there that I couldn't get rid of, and I didn't really know how to get rid of at the time. So it didn't last very long. I think I'm pretty sure I picked up a mic fairly quickly, but it was a very cheap, and I can't even remember the name of it now, I confess, but it was a very cheap sort of USB mic. One thing that has evolved is the price. Because when I first got one, which would probably be around the point that the Xcast, or I might have got it when I did Pick a Flick, which was the second film show after Black Hole Cinema, sort of in line with Black Hole Cinema, where we focused on one particular show, one or two particular films, and got guests on. I might have had that mic then, which was around the time the Xcast was on. But it was all around the 2015 point, because there was actually a gap. I did Black Hole Cinema for a few months, and then I went away for like a year. And then I came back towards the end of 2015 and started again. So there was actually a bit of a gap. So that's the point I think I got a USB mic. So that only cost like 30 quid. And then I remember that just kept, the problem I had with that was there kept being a consistent sort of crackling noise going on. And I think it was something to do with the acoustics and the way it was positioned, and just the fact it was a bit crap, really. It was a bit cheap. And I could not get rid of it. It used to drive me mad. And there were some recordings that were really bad, and they were really affected by it in terms of a consistent sort of that I could not get rid of. So I thought, you know what, I need to upgrade. So I think it was around probably roughly in line with Primitive Culture, I'd imagine. So 2017-ish. I think that's when I bought a Blue Yeti. Do you use a Yeti, a Blue Yeti? They're pretty good Yetis, I think. And so that set me back around 100 quid. And the Yeti served me well for a good 2 or 3 years, I think. And I don't really have many negatives to say about the Yeti at all, really. There were points where the only problem I think I had with that was that the connective sort of USB wire would frequently pack up on me, and I'd have to buy another one, which I don't know if you've ever found that problem.
Probably not, but mine's kind of static in the room that I'm in. I kind of have it on a boom arm, and I don't move it. So
right. You see, unfortunately, I don't have the setup to do that yet. So my setup is mobile, so I put it away when I'm done with it, and it uses cords. And with the one I have now, I haven't had a problem, touch wood, yet. So, but yeah, that kept happening with the Yeti. So it got to about, I think it was the start of last year, and I kept seeing lots of people talk. I thought, I want a new mic. I feel like I want to upgrade again, and I want something a little bit sharper. So I'd heard lots of good things about Rode microphones. I don't know if you say it, Rode. I think it's got, I don't know if it's Scandinavian. It's probably another pronunciation. Anyway, so I picked up a Rode NT USB mic, and there's quite a few of them. I got this for around, I think it was about 130 quid. And it's really good. Like, it's excellent. It's got a built-in pop shield, tripod stand, good cable. The only problem I had is that I'm on a MacBook Pro, and the MacBook Pro, you need an additional USB connector cable to plug in your Rode, because unfortunately Apple are trying to make it so it's impossible to use anything other than Apple tech. Much as I like Apple.
Yeah. Well, we discussed this on Messenger yesterday, but strangely enough.
We did. And I know you're not the first person recently to be telling me that they hate the fact Apple have monopolised everything, but sadly they have. But no, so you have to get an additional. I had to get an additional, but it's worked fine so far, touch wood. So I haven't had any problems with this in a year. So, and the sound quality is great. I don't know if it's necessarily vastly better than the Yeti, but I feel like, I don't know if it is really, but I feel like it's serving a purpose for me right now, and it would be very easy to hook up to a rig as well, which eventually I will want to do. So that's where I am with it, and there are obviously more expensive things available, but this I think is within a reasonable price budget. It's not cheap, but at the same time, it's not like 500 quid, where that's a bit out of my price range right now. So yeah, that's basically where I am.
So the Xcast, an X-Files podcast, was born in 2015. You mentioned on that Homebrew episode that, obviously 2016 was the revival. Was that in your mind when you started to put the Xcast out, and what were the main? I mean, I know that your favourite TV show, obviously, but why that point? Why that time? And what made you jump in? And did you foresee it being where it is now? Considering that at the end of the day, it was going to be a show where you mentioned you put a call out on Twitter. Would anyone like to talk to us about it? How have you seen the progression over the 5 years, and and why particularly the time that you started it? Why then?
Well, I mean, that is easier to answer than the question of how I've evolved, because the XCast has absolutely become something I never would have anticipated. In that it's still relatively niche in its fandom. I'd be lying if I said that it's busting all the charts and it's a mega podcast hit, but it's done well. It's done pretty well. I think in the last 5 years, nearly 4.5 years, we've had close to about 250,000 downloads, which I think is pretty good, really, for a DIY podcast about a show that's, if you take the revivals away, technically not been on the air for nearly 20 years, regularly. So I think I'm delighted, really, and it all began absolutely because of the revival. Because when I started podcasting, I think there was a kernel in my head of an idea of I would like to do the X-Files. But I don't know if it was ever really fully there at the very beginning. But then once the revival was announced in the spring, I think it was, of 2015, I think from then on, and that 2015 was a crazy year. 2015, I was working for a charity in Shropshire, which was a bonkers job. I was meeting who would become my wife around that's the time that the X-Files was announced to be coming back. So we were getting together. I was living with friends, which was quite tumultuous. I was moving in to the house I'm living in now, which was where my future wife was already living. So it was a crazy summer. It was a really bonkers year. And so it was only then around the November time when I'd settled in the house. I don't think I'd told my wife-to-be that I was a podcaster or I was going to podcast, because I don't think she'd have been my wife-to-be if she'd known the amount of time it takes. But I had the space and the comfortable setup to be able to really indulge in this, and that was the point when I thought, the X-Files is coming back in a few months. This feels like the right time to do it. But the reality is, I didn't know, and we met on the Xcast, but I didn't know anyone really who shared the passion for that fandom at that point, who I would be comfortable recording with. Do you know what I mean? To really go for it. Latham, for instance, was on an early couple of episodes of the X-Files, but of the Xcast, but he's really only really got into it in the last few years, mainly because of the podcast. So he was fairly new to it and coming at it, which was great, and it was great that he came on and did that. And he did that more for me, I think, than for the show itself. But I didn't really know anybody, and I roped in a couple of people I knew from other areas, like a guy who was on the first season, who I've since lost touch with, and I don't know where he's gone, really. He's disappeared, called Lee Howard, who did a great podcast called Movie Matters with now quite a successful Scottish crime author, Michael Mackenzie. Brilliant podcast. A great example of how you can really go for a long time and come up with something very, very good. Like, they used to do 4-hour, 5-hour podcasts, but it was really good stuff that they would do. And I got to know Lee a little bit, and he was a big X-Files fan. So he was the first person I sort of connected with, and he did a few over that first season before kind of disappearing from the internet, really. And there were a couple of other people I'd met, like there was a guy called Matt Lambourne, who I knew from the Failed Critics podcast, which I'd kind of been involved with around the time, or overlapping with the Xcast, which I have a good history with as well. And so I brought in him for a few, and also Andrew Brooker, who was on a lot of he was probably the first person really to buy into it, because he recorded quite a few season 1 with me from the very beginning. So Brooker's a massive X-Files fan, and he's somebody I'd met through Failed Critics, and he's still a good friend even now. And so he was marvellous, and I know people really enjoyed our dynamic on that, actually, and they've since said it's great when you and Brooker are recording together, and I agree. He's a fantastic guy. And so he was a big help in that early day. But it was very much a case that I did go out there and I did say, yeah, just who likes the X-Files? And it sort of grew from there, really, because that's when Zach came in. And Zach was already, like I say, had been recording things like Standard Orbit, and he was involved in Trek FM. And then very soon after that, he'd created his own Smallville podcast, which was around the same time as the Xcast, a podcast about Smallville in a very similar format, which is still going strong as well. And then it was only towards the second season, which is when the crew that we know today started to assemble. The Avengers started coming together, really. So people like Sarah Blair, who's a fantastic author. So she came in, a massive X-File. You came in at around that point, I think, as well, as a fan and listener.
Yeah, I came in, I think it was around about the Podwatch.
Yes, so that would
when I
be
started
mid
appearing.
to late 2017, yeah. And just before that, Carl Sweeney, who's been become a key part of the show as well in terms of becoming a guest and a host. He came in around the midpoint of 2017, and then he and I have since become good friends, and he's created his own show called The Movie Palace, which is also now on We Made This, which is a fantastic classic movie podcast. And it just grew from there, partly because we started a group on Facebook called the and this is something I would encourage anyone who has a podcast, a podcast that they're getting listeners from, create a space to talk with these people, is my advice, because the Basement group on Facebook has been fantastic, and it really helped bring a lot of these people together. And then we launched a Patreon, which helped support the show and help us record more, and that's created a lovely little community of about 20, 30 people as well. And it's just grown. It's grown and grown and grown, while still being fairly small and core. You know, I'd say we get per episode, we get about 300 downloads, I'd say, and then it steadily ticks up over time. So we do have some that are into the thousands, but it's taken a few years for those. But that 300 core, sort of 300 to 400 core group of listeners, I think have been there for a while. And I think it's not in the thousands like some podcasts get, but it's fine. I think, the Bex and Eason on Homebrew were very kind to say that we were the X-Files podcast online. And that's lovely. And that's, I think, really the only one that would eclipse us still for downloads, potentially, is Kumail Nanjiani's The X-Files Files, which hasn't been on for years.
I mean,
which is understandable.
I'd throw something in there. Just, I don't know if anyone has spoken to you about this, but when we were at X-Fest 2, there was, which was a festival a convention in Chicago last year, that there were people that obviously we'd got to know on Twitter that, have spoken to me or to Sarah or to Cortland and whoever, that actually were saying, "Oh, we listened to the podcast," and that was really interesting in itself. That the silent people who, we met Maura, who was obviously quite vocal on the group at that time, but there was people who we're aware of. We see them on Twitter, but we don't really communicate with them. But they did make a point of coming up and just saying, "Oh, the podcast is really good." So I think there's also that silent little majority as well, which is great. And I think you're right with the 300 or so people that do listen to the show. Would you rather have that rather than hundreds of thousands of people and none of them speaking to you? That would be a main question, really, because it is more like a family in that way.
No, I'd rather have hundreds of thousands. No, I really do think I would. I mean, it would be nice if it was more like 3,000 consistent listeners who were also involved in the group and were talking. But at the same time, there is something to be said about a core, nice, manageable group of people who you can properly get to know. I mean, I think we all feel like we all know each other and we all are friends. And, like you say, you went to the X-Files convention in Chicago, which because of my work, sadly, I couldn't attend. And, you've created real life friendships, proper things where there's always talks about coming over to England or going over to America and having meetups. And, we've done live shows, we've done, things on Skype. There's Sarah got us into an app called Marco Polo, which allows us to video sort of message each other. A bit like FaceTime, but just like message back and forth. So there's loads of ways that the podcast has sort of extended into other areas of social media. The Facebook group, the Twitter, which is constantly buzzing. There's constantly conversations going on there. As we record, Carl's doing a great thing called Xcast Quarantine, which is all about going through the season episodes day by day and creating discussion while we're in quarantine, in lockdown. So there's lovely things like that going on all the time. We've had Twitter, poll like competition games going on where vote for the best monster, vote for the best episode. So there's things that have grown around the podcast. While the podcast has been consistently around, it feels like it's sort of become more than that. And it's certainly become more than just me, which is why in the most recent episode, The End, appropriately, at the end of season 5, I announced that I'm not going to showrun it anymore. I'm going to hand it over to you. This is maybe an exclusive, actually, to you, Sarah, and Carl, who are going to be sort of running it from season 6 onwards. So, as a consortium, like a collective, with everybody else, and with me chipping in if you need me. But it doesn't need. I'm really quite proud of that more than anything, in a way, that it's sort of not. It's not become about me, because I feel like one of the problems I had with some of my earlier podcasts was that if they felt too much about me in a way, and I feel like, I mean, the very name of my first one was Black Hole Cinema, and people have said, oh yeah, your ego was was off the charts there, and it's a bit like, well, you know, I do ask the question quite a lot, why do people come to a podcast? And I think there is a balance of, they come for, I think at first they come for the content, they come for the subject matter, but they stay for the hosts. I really do believe that. And so I think if you're going to create a podcast, don't make it about you. There's nothing worse when I look on iTunes and I see, oh, the Joe Smith podcast. I'm like, who the fuck is Joe Smith? Like, you know, like, why am I going to listen to some random talk about random stuff all the time? Like, what's the point? You know, it's like, I don't know you. Like, if you're famous, that's the only difference is if they're famous. You know, you get the David Tennant podcast talking to the people. Of course, you're going to listen. Like, you know, he's David Tennant talking to whoever, Ian McKellen. But if it's just some person just randomly talking about stuff, I don't. For me, I think I don't get it. Like, I feel like the what you want to talk about comes first, and then it grows from there. And I think that's what happened with the Xcast. You know, I started it talking about the X-Files. Some people liked me, liked the hosts we got on, and then steadily it grew and grew and grew to the point I can just pop up every now and then and guest, and it will still go on. And people, those 300 who tune in, I think, love to listen to your voice. They love to listen to Carl. They love to listen to Sarah. You know, Kathy, Cortland, all these people who guest, all the fans and all the friends we've got on there who appear. They come for them now, I think, as much as they come for the X-Files. And I think that to me is a testament to a successful podcast, I think.
Yeah. Well, one of the reasons why, I'm not putting words into your mouth here, why you're leaving it is because, you know, you've started to formulate We Made This Podcast Network. Where did that come from? Why did you feel that you needed to take that next step? And is it your personality yourself? Is it stuff you've seen before? Or is it just like a drive that you really wanted to do this? And how do you see the shape of that network forming in the near and to short to medium term future?
I think there is something in me that likes to set something up as opposed to keep doing it. I've talked to Carl about this actually, just in conversations, about how I can't just do one thing all the time. You know, I might have mentioned, I don't know if I mentioned this on Homebrew, but the Xcast fans and the X-Files fans that we know are amazing because they can live and breathe that show 100%, and I think that's amazing. I can't do it. I can't do it that way. I love that show to bits. It's my favourite thing ever. But I have to come away sometimes, and I have to go and do something else. And I think part of in me is that I love lots of different things in terms of pop culture, like particularly television and film. And I've got too many interests that I can possibly do. You know, I've got so many things I'd love to talk about and I'd love to write about and all this kind of thing. And I think ever since I've become involved in these kind of communities, I've wanted to set something up and be the instigation point for other people to create things that I find interesting, admittedly. So, I mean, this goes back to MZP TV, because at the time, when we were doing all the writing, all the fan fiction, I found that I wanted to create, and I created essentially a different version of that. Again, tapping into my ego at first, because it was the Blackster virtual community. I can't help myself, right? And people, Latham will remember this, and maybe one or two people, if they're listening from MZP, will remember this. But around 12, 13 years ago, I set up this alternate sort of, and it was all message boards really, particularly, and we would write like scripts, and that we'd put them into PDF, and then we'd put them on the site. Basically, that was it. It was very simple. But I set this up, and we had spin-offs too. We in fact, the biggest thing I'm most proud of that is that we created a virtual 5th season of Millennium, which obviously you deal with The Time Is Now, with a guy called James Jordan, who since went on to write for television in Britain, and it was great, and it's since been picked up by, you know, the Millennium fan community as sort of the official virtual season 5, and it's on and I know that one or two people who were involved with the show I think even Lance Henriksen has read bits of it as well and liked it. So I'm very, very proud of that, because that started there. And we had lots of other little spin-offs of shows and things, and it didn't last very long, admittedly, because I feel in the end it sort of took away from what we were trying to do on MZP. But it was the starting point of me wanting to create something where other people would have the space to write their show and to write their idea and take their idea. So when it got to the podcasting, I think We Made This sort of came about as my sort of podcasting version of that, in that I started to think about what kind of podcasts do I want to listen to. And one of the maxims I have with this network is I don't, and this is probably me being a bit selfish, but I feel like you've got to if you're trying to create something, you've got to be a bit like this. Do I want anything on this network that I wouldn't want to listen to myself? And the answer is no. And I think you've got to come from a place of, and I have had people pitch me ideas for shows and for, recently, and I've said no because I don't feel like it fits the direction we're going in, and it admittedly isn't something I'm interested in. And I think if to really invest, I've got to want to listen to it. I've got to want to be somebody who'll plug that in. So I feel like We Made This is all about taking what I have learnt so far with the podcasting and my interests in that, and what I've wanted to do from the beginning is give people the space to create their own shows and talk about what they love, really. And there are networks out there that are doing this, absolutely. We're not by any means, a new, fresh thing. But I'd like to think that we're a network where we're potentially quite open to, within the scope of the kind of stuff we're producing, which is primarily popular culture, that we're quite open to sort of giving people a platform to try stuff. So, even if you've never really recorded certainly if you've never hosted or made your own podcast before and you've just been a guest, or even if you've never done anything podcasting wise, it's a space to have a go. Because I think that it can feel a little bit like, anyone can start a podcast, anyone can put something on Apple, but a lot of people don't really know where to begin or what are the rules, in people's minds. What are the rules? Where do I go? How do I sell this? How do I, and I think becoming part of a network like We Made This is that we have a group of people who have experience in various different ways and have done things at various different points. And we're bringing more people in. We brought in people like Colin and Ian and Tracy, the We Dig Music guys, who've been doing this for ages, and they're really experienced in their corner. And they've linked up with Latham with Pick a Disc. And, I brought in people like Paul and Tim who do We Buy Records, who've got a really great following, who are very DIY sort of podcasters, but they love their subject matter, and they bring that infectious stuff into it. And I think having those guys linked up with people like yourself, with The Time Is Now and Make It So, which you do with me, and this podcast, and there will be hopefully more that you will do in time, I'm sure. And all these different things, bringing all those things together, hopefully provides that space that if somebody comes into this and they're starting up fresh, they've got people to draw on, they've got examples to go by, and they might feel like they're less on their own. And that there's more a sense of collegiate community that will promote each other, share each other, and, bring in more listeners. And it sounds, some of this sounds, I'm aware that when I've been talking, it sounds like I'm driven by listeners and the amount of people who I am and I'm not. I feel like I had this discussion with someone the other day about one of our podcasts that isn't doing brilliantly well in terms of listenership. And I said to that person, is this worth your time? Because I feel like there's a balance. Like, I've never seen the point in, some people will say, and they used to say this about the writing, oh, I'm just doing it for me. I don't care if anyone reads. That's a lie. Like, what's the point if you just want your mum to read something, then, that's I just don't believe that. Do you know what I mean? I feel like if you write, if you create, and podcasting is similar in some senses. If you want to share a viewpoint and you want to talk about something, you're not doing it into a vacuum. You want people to listen. You want people to engage with you. You want people to feed back and say, I like this, I do agree, I don't agree, I don't like this, and it grows and grows and grows. So anyone who's saying that they're podcasting just for themselves, I don't believe you. And I think one of the things is that if something isn't doing brilliantly well for whatever reason, is it worth flogging that dead horse to some extent forever? Because it's an incredible amount of effort people put in. So I think there is a balance to be had between doing something you love, but also being aware, are people listening? Am I engaging with people in a way that will give me more excitement to do it, more confidence, will grow what I'm doing? and having that balance. And that's something that we made this. I'm always trying to juggle, I suppose.
Well, it's interesting. I'm going to say something that I probably haven't told you before. So, yeah,
another exclusive. This is good.
Yeah, it's. I think when podcasting for me, I listened to occasional podcasts when I was slightly younger and Xcast wasn't my first one I listened to, but I have been really interested in like talk radio, Sunday night phone-ins. With the local stations, and I listen to Talk Sport a lot and Radio 5 Live, and even LBC Radio I listen to quite a bit as well. Recently, because digital radio became brilliant to be able to do that. But when I've always been someone that, again, similar to what you were saying, I needed to do something. I've got loads on my plate. I've got playing a band. I'm at work, but I've got loads of hours that I do, and it's difficult to formulate some sort of structure. So when the idea of podcasting first came into my mind, I did do it. I got involved with Nate, as you know, and part of that was to kind of like get myself into this realm, purely because I wanted to be on the Xcast. so I was like, right, how do I do this, and try and develop my thing. And it was for me to develop how I speak and how I podcast and whatever, and I did. I got onto the Xcast through the Patreon, which is great, and Pick Up a Podcast this is where the exclusive bit is. So that's where I was, and I got to where I wanted to be, and obviously, it's a great pleasure to be able to take the Xcast on for you and to do that. And Pick Up a Podcast was one of those podcasts where I really did get the need to do more, because I was only on a couple. I was here, there, did a Patreon, did a couple of episodes in the season, and I needed to find something else to do more. And Pick Up a Podcast was that podcast for me. It was, and I know I have discussed this with you before, where it was like I need to find somewhere a niche in the market where it's not necessarily about a TV show or whatever. I just need to find something for practice in regards to that. And Pick Up a Podcast was that. You then, a few weeks later, handed me the Millennium Podcast, and I was like, oh, hang on a second. And that's been amazing. I've absolutely enjoyed everything to do with that. But as that's developed and the Xcast has developed, and we're now doing the Make It So podcast, that I feel that it's time, and this is exactly what I mean by what you're saying about, is it drawn by figures, is it drawn by your own personal thing? But I feel that the Pick Up a Podcast has done its job for me, and I need to think that I need to potentially step back from it a little bit. So this comes to which I've discussed with you before, to the point where this episode is the final episode of the season. So I'm going to take a step back, and you're going to jump in on board with me. So I'm going to still be on the show, but we are going to take it in a slightly different direction, because I feel it's fulfilled what it needed to fulfill with me. But at the same time, the network, I feel, needs this podcast as well. So what have you taken from this podcast itself, and where do you see it projecting a new course to, for a start off? And that's where I'm getting to. But that's the reason why this Pick Up a Podcast became to be in anyway. So yes, I will be taking a step back just for a while and concentrate on the three shows that I'm currently on, which is Make It So with yourself, the Xcast, and The Time Is Now. So yeah, thoughts please, Tony.
Well, there might well be a fourth that you're possibly going to be involved with as well, but we won't. We won't say what that is yet. But there are discussions happening. But no, do you know what? I think that's fine. Just before I answer your question, I think it's important to not feel like you're locked into something. I think the moment you start to feel like it's done its job, then that's the right point to do it. And I think that's kind of how I feel with the Xcast in a way. I feel like part of that is about me wanting to give you guys, because you've been amazing and you've really taken it on and on all hosted, and you've built this community up as much as me. It's not been all me at all. The whole reason that the Xcast has become that family feeling is because of you guys. And I think I have no worry in my mind and no doubt that together you'll keep this podcast going in as great a way as I have, or I've shepherded over these years. So I have no doubt about that. And it's because you and Carl, I mean, Sarah's the only one of the three of you who doesn't host a podcast yet, although I keep trying to push her into it, really. But she does have a baby. Yeah. She does have little kids, and she is a mom and that kind of thing. But she's really good at it. And I think you and Carl have developed your own shows off the back of being on the Xcast. And I think it's something that I'm really proud about, the fact that you guys have got enough of a bug for doing this off the back of that show, that you now really enjoy the process. And it's something that, you may well have done it yourselves eventually, but you might not have done it now. You might not have done it in the way you've done it, really, had it not been for the Xcast. And I love that. And I think that's what I want to encourage from the shows that we do. And so I think with this, I think fine. You've recorded a few. You got an interest in talking to other podcasts. You've had some really great conversations with some people who are on the We Made This Network. Some people who are now on the We Made This Network, who you spoke to beforehand. And I think, to be honest, I mean, people, particularly Latham, going back to him, will hear you say that Tony's going to take over, and he'll go, "Oh God, another one," right? Because I am notorious for, and I was like this when I used to write scripts, actually, as he will remember, but I am notorious for just coming up with an idea and doing it. And I think it's part of my nature in that I have to try something. And, I've tried half a dozen podcasts and I've done one episode and that's it. There was one last year called Movie People that I did with John Rain, who's a great guy on Twitter, got a big following. And it was the idea was that it would be talking to people who are creative about film and things like that online, and talk about their favourite film. And I did one with John, really great conversation. And I had loads of others that I'd talked to people about, and I'd set some things up. And I did one, and I didn't feel the need to do any more. And I was like, do you know what? Yeah, I've done that now. And I feel like I feel like I've ticked that off. And I was like, so there are points where I will try something, I do it for a little bit, and then I'm like, I feel like I've done that. And then there are other things like the Xcast where there is no, that went on for years and years, but it feels like the right time for me to move away. So I think it's absolutely fine for podcasters to get to that point and to not feel like they have to keep something going. Even if you've got people who listen, don't be afraid to move on and do something that really engages you, because that's what keeps you going, I think. And with this, what I want to do is very much take up what you have done already, and I want to keep that balance going of talking to people on the We Made This Network who we haven't spoken to before about their experience putting together a show on the network as well, and also expanding out and talking to other people from other podcast areas. Probably I will gear it, and you've done much the same, I think, but I will gear it towards the same kind of popular culture area that I live in, really. There is an avenue for this to be talking to people from all kinds of different podcast areas. And I'm not saying I won't do that, but I do have a bunch of people that I'm keen to speak to. But then they're all really within the areas of the podcasts I listen to. So maybe I'm being a bit too focused with that. But again, I think you've got to go where your instinct takes you. And I think there are people I just would like to speak to about what their process is, who I don't necessarily work with, but I do know. And some people I don't. So I think that's what I will look at doing. Not in the immediate term. I've got plenty on my plate to keep me busy. I am about to launch a new show called The New Wave as well, which is about 1970s cinema mainly. So I'm going to be doing some of that as well over the summer. So I will get to this, but it will probably be later this year or early next year, I think, when I record a few of these. But I am keen. I am keen to try and see how this works, because I think there are other podcasts that talk to podcasters about podcasting. There are out there, but I feel like it's still a little bit of an area that people don't always go into. The process behind this, how do you put this together? What are the little tricks and secrets? What are debunking the myth of how long it takes as well, because I think some people think this is just an hour.
Yeah.
Oh no. Yeah. It's exploring that, I think. And I think by talking to other people, I mean, you just said to me off air that there was a little trick you picked up from somebody who'd been on Pick Up a Podcast recently. That is how you grow, I think, by talking to other podcasters and learning from them, and like I said earlier, taking some of the things they do well and adapting it for yourself. So that's kind of what I want to do with it, really. And it's as much about me learning as it is giving other people an insight.
Well, it goes back to that whole, you've got to be invested in it. I mean, this is been a good thing, as I say. It's been, for however many episodes it's been, that I have done a bit of that. There's been a bit of a mix of how did you get into it, where did you get into it, why did you get into it, what equipment do you use, what disasters have you had, things like that, which is great. And I think that, personally, talking from a personal point of view with regards to the network, I think that it is a good show to have, and it could almost be a medium for guests within the network and externally from the network as well. That, it isn't a popular culture one, but it is, if you focus it in that way, that you get the people that you want to get in. And as I say, it's a learning curve, and I think that I'm not going anywhere. I'll still be about. I'll still do ones that pop up if happen to come across somebody that might want to come onto the show. I'll definitely do it. But I think it's the prep time that I've struggled with this year. That's been my problem, is that, which is going to be my next question actually. It's about getting the guests on, where I've had things lined up and I haven't been let down. That's not what I'm saying. Other people have different priorities, and sometimes what you plan, the best laid plans, don't work out. And I've struggled a little bit over the last few months with things like that, where I just don't have the time to chase it, and that's been a particularly strong issue for me. And it's like, right, whereas the other shows have been, you've got to call people that can call on, who you've got, and where you are, and I like to plan as well. And this COVID-19, as we're currently talking about at the moment, we're Easter weekend at the moment. The peak hasn't quite hit, but the last 2 or 3 weeks at work for me have been particularly bad, because I didn't know what I was doing 24 hours, 72 hours in advance, and I don't like that, and I like to plan. And that's one of the issues as well, is that I need to take a step back from that, because as much as I'd like to plan and things aren't going quite right, then I just felt it was time to call it a day and just do it more ad hoc, like it is. But that was so. My next couple of questions are going to be with regards to the Xcast and other podcasts that you've done. You mentioned about the people you've got on. You seem to have no fear in being able to ask people to come on, and just, like you said with the Xcast, it was like, who wants to come on, who wants to do this, who wants to do that. That's a particular difficulty of mine to get over. Is that just something that's in your nature? Is that something you just literally you think about a question and go, well, there's no fear in doing that? How does that work for you?
I think it's because I'm impulsive, for one thing. Right. And if I get a bee in my bonnet, I will. I think probably my wife would say it's the only child in me. I think I just get a bee in my bonnet, and I just want to do it there and then. Hence why people who know me will know that I've emailed them about half a dozen podcasts that have never come to anything, and I've said, put your name down for this, and then it doesn't happen, because there will come a point where I'll get really excited about something, and then I think it through, and then it doesn't go anywhere. And bless them, quite a lot of the people who I do email repeatedly still want to talk to me. I keep thinking eventually they're going to go, piss off, Tony, we're never going to get anywhere. So it is a bit of a crapshoot. It's like maybe 1 in 5 podcasts that I plan to do and I figure out doing are going to ever happen, probably. And I think it's in my nature just to put a call out there and see. You may not think this, but if ever I am about to record with someone I've never spoken to before, I am always very nervous. I always get a level of, anxiety in a way, because you don't know how it's going to go.
Yeah, you don't know the chemistry, do you? How it
you don't know the chemistry.
Great, sometimes it doesn't. So
absolutely, and sometimes and I've been lucky in that very rarely have I faced this problem. But sometimes you will record with people and you'll talk and you'll go through something and you'll set up a big question. What do you think about this kind of this area of the X-Files? Do you think it's a good thing that they did there? And then and what do you think? And then they go, yeah, it's really interesting.
That's it.
And that's it, right? And so you never quite know what you're going to get. And it's one of the reasons why I look back and I think I do tend to sort of work with the same people quite often. You know, I'm particularly fond of. I like recording with you because I know that I'm going to have a great discussion. I like recording with Carl. You know, we did a show called Motion Pictures, which is we're still figuring out what we want to do with that. But we had 7 discussions that I'm really proud of, and so, as is he. And I hope one day we can do more stuff together. And he's going to be on the New Wave a fair bit. You know, Darren Mooney, who doesn't host a podcast for We Made This, but he's on loads of them. He's amazing to talk to, and he's a lovely bloke. And then people like Brooker, as I've said. And then Sarah, if ever I'm recording with Sarah, as I've talked about, it's just great. There's so many people who I will tend to go back to, or I love talking to, and I want to talk to again. I might suggest guests and try and connect up with different people, but I'm always anxious if it's somebody new. And but my thinking is, what's the worst that can happen? Like, well, for one thing, if you put a call out, they can say no. And I've had plenty of people turn around and say no, thanks, but no thanks. You know, people I've wanted to speak to. And, you know, it is a bit of a shame. You know, I do feel a little bit, you know, and you have to sort of fight that feeling of, why don't they want to talk to me? You know?
Yeah.
But you know what? Some people do, some people don't. And I think to myself, well, fair enough. Like, you know, if you don't, you don't. And there's nothing I can do about that. And you've got to think, well, it's not a reflection on me. You can't have it be a reflection on me. You know, some people, it might dent their confidence. I'm a bit like, well, fine, you're missing out. so I'll just find somebody else. Oh, it is about me.
Yeah, well, you're not going to talk to me then. That's fine.
It's a little bit like the whole thing of, well, I can't make you do that, so I'm not going to make it a reflection on the fact you don't like me, you don't want to talk to me. I'm just going to think, fine, okay, I'll find somebody else, and there will always be somebody else, and there might be times where it wasn't the person you envisaged or you wanted for that project, and I'm at the point now where for certain things there are certain people I want, and there's certain people I think would be better at it. And 9 times out of 10, I get that person involved, and they do it, and they want to do it. And sometimes it doesn't happen. But I'm very much of the mindset of ask anyone, because you 9 times out of 10, and this is the approach I've taken with famous people as well, particularly on the Xcast. You know, we've been lucky in that we've had some brilliant people on there who've been involved with the show, and almost all of them say yes. And you don't always think they will. You know, like William B. Davis, who played the Smoking Man's not going to come on. Yet he's come on twice. Like, we're not going to get Stephen Williams, who played Mr. X, and he came on and you spoke to him, and he was a geezer, that guy. He's brilliant, right?
Yeah,
such a lovely man.
Behind the scenes on that, he was he completely forgot about that call and said, "Can you phone me back later?" So, but yeah, he was a diamond geezer. He was a
lovely bloke.
I had a great conversation with him off air as well, and those are things that people don't hear and see. But he was a geezer.
Exactly. You know, and it came across in the podcast. And there's so many people. You know, I had and Chris Owens, who was another actor on the Xcast. On the X-Files, who played Spender. We had a lovely chat with him, and he sent me like pictures of his house at Halloween, you know, and things like that afterwards. So you often find that these people who you might at first go, and whether they're famous or not, and you might at first go, oh no, I don't think I should bother them. You know, a lot of the time they want to be involved, you know, or they're flattered or they're interested. So I am kind of that person that just goes for that, really, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, and you only, and even when, you know, you do get those people come on, you only learn whether or not you have that. If it's somebody who isn't famous and he's just coming on for one episode, if it's somebody you think could be, a future collaborator, you only know by doing, you know, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But I'm always nervous, Kurt. Don't think I'm not.
It's kind of that band syndrome. I don't necessarily get nervous when I'm playing with the band, but it's really strange if there's depending on the actual circumstances. So, for example, if we go and playing at a wedding, it's the same thing day in, day out. You know, so every Friday, Saturday night, we go out. We're going to play at our wedding. We're going to be travelling, 200 miles to go and do this do, and we get there, we set up, speak to the bride and groom. Okay, yeah, we're all good. We're going to be cutting the cake, doing whatever. That's fine. Put me in front of a particular event or show that we do regularly, and I'm saying like 3 or 4 times a year, but it's very much a holiday camp, for example, where they sit down and watch you for the first half. I find I really struggle over the first 3 or 4 songs because it's not your regular thing, or it's not it's not your comfort zone. And I think that's similar. It's so, and I've been playing in bands since 1996. So it's been a long, long time, but I still get nervous. And I think that's probably a good thing because, that nerve, it shows that you're still wanting to do it and you still care for it.
But I think as well, I agree. But I think as well, it's important to try and push yourself out of that comfort zone as well sometimes. Not always. I think that the comfort zone's fine. If you've got a good rapport with people that you trust and you want to talk about, it can make for an easier, a better podcast sometimes. But I think, if you're dubious, I'd go for it, because I think sometimes you can be really surprised, and it can help with confidence for one thing. About that, it really can build confidence about your worth as a podcaster, and it make connections, because that's the other thing. Podcasting is all about connections. If I was to go back 5 years and write down all the people that I was involved with and connected with podcasting, and then do it again now, the list would be vastly different. And it would be much bigger, and I would be able to list all these different people that I've linked up with, even if it's just once. They're potentially people you could go back to the well and say, would you want to do that again? And that's happened. For Make It So, a good example is the author Una McCormack, who wrote Star Trek books. Brilliant writer, lovely person, came on to talk about her book. We got on well, nice correspondence. She now is hopefully coming back on just to talk about an episode of Discovery, later on. And that's a contact we've made, and that's somebody who... There's always, for people like that, I always anticipate there's an angle of they should be talking about their projects. They should be using it as a promotional tool, because that's ultimately their bread and butter. And I fully encourage that. And I'm like, yeah, absolutely, talk about the things you're doing. But they wouldn't say yes if they didn't think that, if they didn't like you as a person, or I didn't like you as a podcaster, and didn't think that it would damage their brand, for one thing, by being on your show. Because that's the other thing. Some people, it's a two-way street. Some people might come on to a podcast and they might not have a good experience. And your job as a podcaster, especially as a host, is to make them have as good an experience and as comfortable an experience as possible, and not make them feel stressed, tense, awkward, and make it a difficult experience. You want them to have fun, but also feel like they had a good experience, and that they weren't made uncomfortable. And that's number one. And that's something that not everyone can do, but it's also something you can learn and develop. And I like to think that whenever I host with people who I haven't recorded with before, even if they don't necessarily want to do it again, I hope that they haven't had a bad experience, because that would be the failure for me more than anything else if they had.
Right. I think that brings us pretty much to the end of the conversation. The one thing I would maybe ask you about is the idea of the patronage and keeping podcasts on the road. Really, that the network has been. You mentioned about being a gateway. The network is a great way of doing that because of things of costs involved, and Patreon is currently the way forward for bringing in financials to help run the podcast. How have you found that kind of aspect to it? Not necessarily about making money, because that's not what it's about. It's just keeping things ticking over, and especially with you increasing the size of the community that you're bringing in. How have you found that, and where do you see that going? Do you see that is an issue you might have to come up with, or have you got a kind of a master plan that you kind of, or have at least a destination in mind to how you're going to control the network moving forward?
Patreon is very interesting in this because it is a fine balancing act, I think. Patreon, I think, is really useful for anyone who's creating these days, because podcasting is something you're never gonna get a job being a podcaster. It's very, very unlikely. You're never gonna get a wage, but you can, with time, if you have the time and space, you can offer things that people will be willing to buy into. And I think that's important. With a Patreon for a podcast, some people don't do it because I think they feel it's quite mercenary. And it's like trying to get people to pay for stuff. The way I see it is you're encouraging them to buy into what you are offering, as opposed to buying for it's not like going to a shop and buying, a CD. or buying a Blu-ray. You're asking them to buy into you almost as a person, or you as a group of people. And the most successful patrons out there, I think, for whatever artistic endeavor, it's not as much about what you're providing. It's more about what you, the person you are. And I think, yes, there is always an interest level. Anyone who buys into the Xcast Patreon is going to be a fan of the X-Files, yes. And frequently people will buy in and they'll drift away and they'll cancel. And I understand why people do that a lot of the time. And I will always try and message people and say, hi, how come, basically? Can we, do blah, blah, blah? And most of the time it's financial issues. And, anyone who buys into a Patreon in this day and age is wonderful, because money is tight for everybody all over the world. So if you're willing to give up even $5 a month, £3.50 or whatever it is, £4 a month if you're in the UK, which it doesn't sound a lot, it's enough. That's enough. That could go towards something else. Any money you get is a real plus point. And so it's a constant balancing act of making sure that it's not, they don't feel like it's just about a money-making machine, because it isn't. There's a lot of more effort you have to and you want to put into a Patreon to make people feel like they're part of a community and that they're buying into what you offer. And it's something we've now started with Make It So in the early days, and we've got 2 or 3 fantastic patrons on there who we're getting involved with and creating some content with, and hopefully they're enjoying it so far. But there is a level of effort that you've got to put in, and you've got to make sure that you're on top of if you really want people to continue buying into it. And there have been times where I've struggled with that balance, and a couple of times there have been people who've called me on that, actually, for the Xcast, and said, why am I buying into this? And it's had to make me stop and think. And I've gone, yeah, why are they buying into this? What can we do to change that? And so it is constantly learning from that and going by what kind of things people want, or what they, with reasonable expectations. We can't be creating something every day for a person in a Patreon. We just can't do it. There isn't the resources to do that. If they sign up knowing the boundaries and knowing what you can offer and making it reasonable within your time and what you can do, they will sign up and they will want to support what you're doing, I think. And in terms of the network, it's been a massive help. Anyone who does it or is thinking of doing it, I don't make any profit money from this, really. Everything is paying for network stuff. Particularly now, what we've done is we made this in order to increase the scope for what people who come onto the network can have. I've bought into something called Basecamp, which is a backstage sort of planning and service, which also is used for patron areas and things like that. And it's not cheap. It's quite a lot of money every month, but it's worth it. It's worth it to help build this into a proper space, as opposed to just using Google Documents and messages here and all this kind of thing. I want a centralized nexus where we can plan, we can do all these things. But that's not cheap. You've got to pay for your hosting, which is, for the amount we need, which is a good amount a month. You've got to pay for Dropbox. You've got to pay for things like sometimes Epidemic Sound or something like that. If you want music jingles, you've got to pay for Photoshop in order to create images and things like that. Now, some people might not buy into all those things and do it in other ways and stuff like that, which is fair enough. But that's what I tend to use. I tend to use various different areas, and it costs. So the Patreon pays for this whole endeavour. So anyone who chips in is not just buying into me, in fact, they're buying into creating this whole network of podcasts and giving these people these opportunities. So and that's the definition of the name. We made this. It's a play on I made this. The little, at the end of the X-Files, you get the little I made this thing. But I wanted it to be a feeling of we're all in this together. We're all doing this, and we're all creating stuff that we really love. So that sort of dials down to the ethos of what it's all about.
Excellent. Well, I think that's perfect time to call it a day. So, Tony, what are your plans in the near to medium future with regards to podcasting and what you're going to be doing? And where can people find more information on We Made This itself and the podcast that you're going to be on? Okay, well, number one plan, in order to facilitate more podcasting, I am going to not die. Right, okay.
From the epidemic. That's number one, okay? So to do that, I'm going to stay in and I'm not going to go anywhere. I'm going to lock down. And please, guys, if you're going out, only do it when you have to. Otherwise, stay indoors. Listen to your government, okay? Because for once, they're right. So, beyond that, I'm going to be doing various different things over the next few months. So we've got Make It So, which is still going. You can find that at Jean-Luc Poddard. We've got the Xcast, of course, on Twitter, which is at the X_cast, which is going into the Fight the Future Minute project soon, next month, which is going to be a podcast for the next 220 days nearly, basically, of podcasts. So it's going to be great. Talking about the movie, The Fight the Future. So, and Make It So, we'll be talking about season 1 of Discovery, which we're getting into now, which is going to be great. We'll have The New Wave, which you can find at New Wave Pod on Twitter, which is all about the 60s to 80s kind of cinema in the new Hollywood era. So it's covering some amazing films, like, you know, just some really massive films from Star Wars through to The Shining, The Exorcist, to things you've never heard of before, like Putney Swope. Who's heard of Putney Swope?
Oh, certainly not me.
Exactly. No, nobody. So that's going to be coming in June as well. And I dare say there'll be various other bits and bobs. I'll be doing the odd Primitive Culture as well on Trek FM, as we've talked about. So if you want to find out all about the We Made This stuff, just go to @WeMadeThisPod on Twitter. We're also on Facebook if you type in We Made This, and go to the website WeMadeThisPod.com. And if you want to find out what I'm doing personally, just go to AJ Black Writer on Twitter, AJ Black Podcaster Writer on Facebook, and you get my page, and also my website, ajblackwriter.com. So that's it, basically.
Fantastic. Well, I'll echo some of that. Obviously, I am on Make It So with Tony. I'm actually recording one tonight, which will be great. So I'm going to start talking to Amy Nelson, so that will be coming out soon. That's on Star Trek Discovery. The Xcast, as we've mentioned, we just want to say thank you. I'm sure that there's some plans in place for a little bit of a celebratory podcast when we get to that point, Tony. So we'll certainly talk about that in the near future. For sure. For the Xcast, you can find me on the Time Is Now pod as well, as mentioned earlier. The Millennium podcast, that is back and is continuing on with season 2, which is a really unique time to be doing it, considering that a plague is the final 2 episodes. So, so that's going to be an interesting recording when I get to that one. But those are the places you can find me. And if you wanted to talk to me, I'm on Twitter, and that's at @Moldrake. You'll also hear stuff that's on the We Made This Podcast network just at the end of this podcast as well, so stay tuned for that. But again, Tony, thank you. And as I say, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to do this podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure. It's been a great sounding board for me personally to get my chops together, to get an idea how podcasting works, and while also maintaining sort of the quality that we've been able to do with the Xcast and the Time Is Now especially. And as you say, I have got some ideas and thoughts in the works. Similar to you, I've had some other ideas which haven't come off, but they are still in the back of my mind of maybe doing years down the line. So that'll be something to bear in mind. But yeah, thank you very much for that. So this isn't the end of Pick Up a Podcast. It will continue on in some form. I will be back, and Tony will be joining me to help run this one as well. So by all means, check it out later in the year, where, as we've discussed before, he'll be getting in some guests. So that'll be fantastic. But thank you very much. And until next time, everyone, stay safe, stay at home. As Tony mentioned there, we need to get through this pandemic. You need to be able to listen to what we're talking about. There's plenty on the We Made This Podcast network to listen to, so I would suggest that you come and listen to that. But until next time, we'll see you there, and we'll see you on the other side. Thank you.
Previously on the We Made This network. The Time Is Now, a Millennium podcast.
What did you think to that element of the episode? It was subtly played, and Lara does give an explanation later on in the episode that could be just a standard answer to it. But how did you think that played throughout the episode?
Yeah, I think it played okay, but I think, again, the other issues with this episode, it does feel kind of non-committal. Because you're right, when you see him on the phone, and it's almost like his face changes. He's like, oh yeah, I can feel this one.
Don't say the C word.
Is it possible within our lifetime that we could see a person on Mars?
I will tell you now that if you know a child who, if you're listening to this in England, is in like reception or year 1, or if you're
My
listening to
nephew.
this in America, your nephew is the age that we expect will be the first human on Mars.
Do you know, he seemed quite bright when he was very little. I said, he could have a job that doesn't exist for us yet by the time he's an adult. So maybe it is Martian astronaut.
The Xcast, an X-Files podcast.
It feels very much like it's kind of a placeholder. Like, there's a lot of this episode feels like it was kind of mapped out, and there's like ideas and there's like little index cards on a board, and a sense of we'll come back and we'll fill that in later, except we ran out of time, so just run with first idea, best idea. And a lot of things that you're right, where the things work as concepts rather than as characters, where Fowley works as a concept rather than a character, where you can tell that they needed something to serve as, inverted commas, the key to the X-Files, but they couldn't figure out what it was, so just make it a psychic kid.
Check out all of these shows and more on the We Made This podcast network.
Pick Up a Podcast is created and hosted by Kurt North and is part of the We Made This podcast network. It can be found on Twitter at Pick Up a Podcast. Music for the show is created by David Kennedy and produced by David Kennedy, Kurt North and Ian Curtin. Check out the We Made This podcast network on Twitter at We Made This Pod and on Facebook by searching We Made This. There is also a website. Check that out at www.wemadethispod.com. Thanks for listening.